1960s was a decade of profound change in the United States, a time when the nation's social, political, and cultural landscape underwent a dramatic transformation. This era, often referred to as the swinging 60s, was marked by a series of pivotal events that would shape the course of American history for generations to come. In this exploration, we'll delve into the top 5 events that left an indelible mark on the decade and continue to influence American society today. As we journey through these transformative events, we'll uncover the complex tapestry of forces that drove change during this tumultuous period. From the struggle for civil rights to the space race, from the counterculture movement to the Vietnam War, the 1960s were a crucible of innovation, conflict, and progress. Each of these events not only defined the decade, but also set the stage for the America we know today. Our first pivotal event takes us to the heart of one of the most significant social movements in American history, the Civil Rights Movement. While the struggle for equality had been ongoing for centuries, the 1960s saw this movement reach its zenith, with one moment standing out as a turning point: the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. On August 28, 1963, more than 250,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C., in what would become one of the largest political rallies for human rights in United States history. The March on Washington was a powerful demonstration of unity and purpose, bringing together people from all walks of life who shared a common vision of equality and justice. At the heart of this historic gathering was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose "I Have a Dream" speech would become one of the most iconic and influential orations in American history. King's words, delivered from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, painted a vivid picture of a future America free from the shackles of racism and discrimination. The impact of the March on Washington and King's speech cannot be overstated. It galvanized public opinion and put immense pressure on the federal government to act on civil rights legislation. The event was a catalyst for the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, two landmark pieces of legislation that would fundamentally alter the legal and social landscape of America. But the March on Washington was more than just a political event. It was a cultural watershed moment. It demonstrated the power of peaceful protest and the ability of ordinary citizens to effect change. The images of a diverse crowd united in purpose challenged the entrenched narratives of racial division and offered a glimpse of what a truly integrated America might look like. The success of the March on Washington also inspired other marginalized groups to organize and demand their rights. Women's rights activists, LGBTQ+ advocates, and other social justice movements would draw inspiration from the civil rights movement's tactics and successes in the years to come. However, it's important to note that the March on Washington, while a high point, was just one moment in a long and ongoing struggle. The civil rights legislation that followed did not immediately erase centuries of institutionalized racism and discrimination. In many ways, the march highlighted how far America had come in its journey towards equality, but also how far it still had to go. The events surrounding the March on Washington also revealed the deep divisions within American society. While many celebrated the progress represented by the march and subsequent legislation, others resisted change, sometimes violently. The backlash against civil rights gains would shape political alignments and social dynamics for decades to come. As we move further into the 1960s, our second transformative event takes us from the streets of Washington to the surface of the moon. On July 20th, 1969, millions of people around the world watched in awe as American astronaut Neil Armstrong took his first steps on the lunar surface, declaring, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The moon landing was the culmination of a decade-long space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. President John F. Kennedy had set the ambitious goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, and against all odds, America had achieved it. This monumental accomplishment not only demonstrated American technological prowess, but also captured the imagination of people around the world. The Apollo 11 mission, which brought Armstrong and fellow astronaut Buzz Aldrin to the moon's surface, was a testament to human ingenuity and perseverance. It pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible and ushered in a new era of scientific and technological advancement. The innovations developed for the space program would go on to have countless applications in everyday life, from computer technology to medical breakthroughs. But the significance of the moon landing went far beyond its scientific and technological achievements. It was a moment of unity for a nation that had been deeply divided by the Vietnam War, civil rights struggles, and political assassinations. For a brief moment, Americans of all backgrounds came together in shared pride and wonder at what their country had accomplished. The moon landing also had profound psychological and philosophical implications. Seeing the Earth from space for the first time gave humanity a new perspective on our planet and our place in the universe. The iconic Earthrise photograph, taken by the Apollo 8 crew in 1968, became a symbol of the environmental movement, highlighting the fragility and beauty of our home planet. In the realm of popular culture, the space race and the moon landing had an enormous impact. Science fiction, once a niche genre, exploded in popularity as the public's fascination with space and technology grew. The optimism and forward-thinking spirit of the space program influenced everything from fashion to architecture, giving rise to futuristic designs and a fascination with all things space age. However, the moon landing also had its critics. Some questioned the enormous expense of the space program at a time when many Americans were living in poverty. Others saw it as a distraction from pressing social issues at home. These debates about the priorities of government spending and the balance between scientific advancement and social progress continue to this day. The success of the Apollo program also marked the beginning of a new phase in the Cold War. While it represented a clear victory for the United States in the space race, it also led to increased cooperation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in space exploration. This collaboration would become one of the few areas of positive engagement between the two superpowers during the Cold War. As we reflect on the moon landing, it's clear that its impact extended far beyond the scientific realm. It was a moment that inspired a generation to dream big and push the boundaries of human achievement. The famous words of Neil Armstrong continue to resonate, reminding us of the power of human ambition and the importance of exploring the unknown. Our third transformative event of the 1960s brings us back down to Earth, to the campuses and streets where a new cultural revolution was taking shape. The rise of the counterculture movement, epitomized by the Summer of Love in 1967, represented a seismic shift in American values and social norms. The Summer of Love, centered in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury neighborhood, saw thousands of young people gather to reject traditional societal values and experiment with new ways of living. This movement, often associated with hippies, free love, and psychedelic experiences, was about much more than just music festivals and flower power. It was a radical reimagining of American society. At its core, the counterculture movement was a rebellion against the conservatism and conformity of the 1950s. Young people questioned authority, challenged traditional gender roles, and sought to create a more open and egalitarian society. They embraced new forms of spirituality, experimented with communal living, and advocated for environmental awareness long before it became mainstream. Music played a crucial role in spreading the ideals of the counterculture. Artists like the Beatles, Bob Dylan, and Jimi Hendrix didn't just provide a soundtrack to the era. They helped shape its values and aesthetics. The Monterey Pop Festival in 1967 and Woodstock in 1969 became iconic events that showcased the power of music to unite people and express the spirit of a generation. The fashion of the counterculture was more than just a style statement. It was a form of rebellion. Long hair, vibrant colors, and unconventional clothing choices were ways for young people to visually separate themselves from the older generation and express their individuality. These fashion choices often blurred traditional gender lines, reflecting changing attitudes about gender roles and sexuality. However, the counterculture movement was not without its contradictions and darker elements. While it preached peace and love, it also saw a rise in drug use that led to addiction and other social problems. The movement's rejection of traditional values sometimes led to a lack of direction and purpose for some of its adherents. The impact of the counterculture extended far beyond the 1960s. Many of the values espoused by the movement, environmentalism, sexual liberation, spiritual exploration, would become integrated into mainstream American culture in the decades that followed. The emphasis on personal freedom and self-expression continues to influence American society today. The counterculture also had a significant impact on politics. Many young people became politically active, protesting against the Vietnam War and advocating for civil rights and women's liberation. This political engagement would shape a new generation of leaders and activists who would go on to influence American policy in the following decades. As we examine the legacy of the counterculture, it's important to recognize that it was not a monolithic movement. It encompassed a wide range of ideas and experiences, from peaceful protesters to radical activists, from spiritual seekers to hedonistic thrill seekers. This diversity reflected the complex and often contradictory nature of American society itself. The Summer of Love and the broader counterculture movement represented a moment of profound cultural change in American history. It challenged established norms, expanded the boundaries of personal freedom, and left an indelible mark on American art, music, fashion, and values. As we continue to grapple with issues of individual liberty, social justice, and cultural identity, the echoes of the 1960s counterculture continue to resonate. Our fourth transformative event of the 1960s takes us to the international stage, and a conflict that would deeply scar the American psyche, the Vietnam War. While U.S. involvement in Vietnam began in the 1950s, it was during the 1960s that the conflict escalated dramatically, becoming a defining issue of the decade. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 marked a turning point in America's involvement in Vietnam. Following an alleged attack on U.S. naval ships by North Vietnamese forces, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving President Lyndon B. Johnson broad authority to escalate U.S. military involvement in the conflict. This decision would have far-reaching consequences for both Vietnam and the United States. As the war intensified, so did its impact on American society. The draft brought the reality of the conflict home to millions of American families. Young men faced the prospect of being sent to fight in a war that many did not understand or support. This led to widespread draft resistance and an increase in young men pursuing college deferments, highlighting class disparities in who was most likely to be sent to war. The media played a crucial role in shaping public perception of the Vietnam War. For the first time, a war was broadcast directly into American living rooms through television news. Graphic images of the conflict, including the famous photograph of a young girl fleeing a napalm attack, brought the horrors of war into sharp focus for the American public. As casualties mounted and the strategic purpose of the war became increasingly unclear, public opinion began to turn against the conflict. Anti-war protests became a common sight on college campuses and in cities across the country. The peace movement brought together diverse groups, from students to clergy to veterans, in a common cause of ending U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The Vietnam War had a profound impact on American politics. The credibility gap between the government's optimistic public statements about the war and the reality on the ground eroded public trust in political institutions. This disillusionment would contribute to a broader questioning of authority that characterized the late 1960s and early 1970s. The war also exposed and exacerbated racial tensions in the United States. African Americans were disproportionately represented among combat troops and casualties, leading many civil rights leaders to question why Black Americans were fighting for freedoms abroad that they were denied at home. Martin Luther King Jr.'s decision to speak out against the war in 1967 linked the struggle for civil rights with the anti-war movement. The economic cost of the war was substantial, contributing to inflation and economic instability in the late 1960s and early 1970s. President Johnson's attempts to fund both the war and his ambitious domestic programs, known as the Great Society, put a strain on the federal budget and the U.S. economy as a whole. As the war dragged on, its impact on American culture deepened. The conflict became a central theme in literature, film, and music of the era. Works like Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried and films like Apocalypse Now would go on to shape how future generations understood and remembered the war. The end of the 1960s did not bring an end to the Vietnam War or its impact on American society. The conflict would continue into the 1970s, with the last U.S. troops withdrawing in 1973 and Saigon falling to North Vietnamese forces in 1975. The war's legacy would continue to influence American foreign policy, popular culture, and national identity for decades to come. The Vietnam War's impact extended beyond the political and social spheres, deeply affecting the men and women who served. Many veterans returned home to a nation divided over the war, often facing hostility or indifference. The psychological toll of the conflict, including what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, would haunt many veterans for years to come. The war also had a significant impact on the way Americans viewed their government and military. The Pentagon Papers, leaked in 1971, revealed that the government had misled the public about the extent and nature of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. This revelation further eroded public trust in institutions and contributed to a more skeptical, less deferential attitude towards authority. As we move to our fifth and final transformative event of the 1960s, we turn to a technological revolution that would change the way we live and work, the birth of the modern computing era. While the foundations of computer science were laid in the 1940s and 1950s, it was during the 1960s that computing began to emerge as a force that would reshape society. The 1960s saw rapid advancements in computer technology, driven in part by the space race and Cold War competition. The development of integrated circuits and microchips laid the groundwork for the personal computer revolution that would follow in later decades. Companies like IBM became household names as computers began to enter the business world. One of the most significant developments of this era was the creation of ARPANET in 1969, the precursor to the modern Internet. This network, developed by the U.S. Department of Defense, allowed different computers to communicate with each other over long distances. While it would be decades before the World Wide Web emerged, the seeds of our interconnected digital world were planted in the 1960s. The rise of computing technology had profound implications for the workforce. As businesses began to adopt computers for data processing and other tasks, new job categories emerged while others became obsolete. This shift marked the beginning of the transition from an industrial economy to an information economy in the United States. Computer technology also began to influence popular culture during this decade. Science fiction writers like Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke explored the potential and perils of artificial intelligence and advanced computing. Films like 2001: A Space Odyssey introduced the public to the concept of sentient computers, sparking discussions about the future relationship between humans and machines. The advent of computer technology in the 1960s also raised new questions about privacy and data security. As more information began to be stored electronically, concerns arose about who had access to this data and how it could be protected. These debates foreshadowed the complex privacy issues we grapple with in the digital age. Education was another area significantly impacted by the rise of computing. Universities began offering computer science courses, and a new generation of students became fascinated with the potential of this emerging technology. The 1960s saw the birth of hacker culture on college campuses, as students pushed the boundaries of what computers could do. The growth of computing technology also had geopolitical implications. The ability to process and analyze large amounts of data gave nations new tools for intelligence gathering and strategic planning. The computer became a new frontier in the ongoing technological competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. As we reflect on these 5 transformative events of the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement, the moon landing, the counterculture movement, the Vietnam War, and the birth of modern computing, we can see how they collectively reshaped American society. Each of these events challenged existing norms, pushed boundaries, and set new trajectories for the nation. The Civil Rights Movement forced America to confront its history of racial injustice and take concrete steps towards equality. While the struggle for civil rights was far from over by the end of the decade, the groundwork had been laid for future progress. The movement's emphasis on nonviolent resistance and its success in achieving legislative change would inspire future social justice movements. The moon landing demonstrated America's technological prowess and captured the world's imagination. It showed what could be achieved when a nation united behind a common goal. The spirit of innovation and exploration that drove the space program would continue to influence American science and technology for decades to come. The counterculture movement challenged traditional values and expanded the boundaries of personal freedom. While the movement itself was relatively short-lived, its impact on American culture was long-lasting. Many of the ideas that seemed radical in the 1960s, environmentalism, gender equality, spiritual exploration, would become mainstream in the following decades. The Vietnam War had a profound and lasting impact on American society and politics. It led to a re-evaluation of America's role in the world and a more skeptical attitude towards government and military interventions. The divisions exposed and exacerbated by the war would continue to shape American political discourse for years to come. Finally, the birth of modern computing set the stage for the digital revolution that would transform every aspect of society in the coming decades. While the full impact of this technology was not yet apparent in the 1960s, the foundations were being laid for the information age. Collectively, these events paint a picture of a decade of profound change and contradiction. It was a time of great optimism and deep disillusionment, of remarkable progress and painful setbacks. The 1960s saw America reach new heights of technological achievement while also grappling with deep-seated social and political challenges. The legacy of the 1960s is complex and continues to be debated. For some, it represents a golden age of idealism and progress. For others, it marks the beginning of a breakdown in traditional values and social cohesion. What is clear is that the events of this decade fundamentally altered the course of American history. As we look back on the 1960s from our vantage point in the 21st century, we can see how the issues and movements of that era continue to resonate. The struggle for racial equality, the tension between individual freedom and social responsibility. The challenge of balancing technological progress with human values. These are all themes that continue to shape our national discourse. The 1960s remind us of the power of individuals and movements to effect change, even in the face of significant opposition. Whether it was civil rights activists facing down fire hoses and police dogs, scientists and engineers working tirelessly to put a man on the moon, or young people reimagining social norms, the decade was marked by a belief that change was possible and necessary. At the same time, the 1960s teach us about the complexity of social change. Progress in one area often revealed or exacerbated problems in another. The decade's events highlight the interconnectedness of social, political, and technological developments and the often unforeseen consequences of rapid change. As we face the challenges of our own era, from climate change to technological disruption to ongoing struggles for equality, the lessons of the 1960s remain relevant. They remind us of the importance of civic engagement, the power of collective action, and the need to consider the long-term implications of our choices. In conclusion, the 5 events we've explored, the civil rights movement, the moon landing, the counterculture movement, the Vietnam War, and the birth of modern computing, each left an indelible mark on American society. Together, they define the 1960s as a decade of transformation, a period that reshaped America's social, political, and technological landscape in ways that continue to influence us today. The 1960s were a crucible of change, a time when long-standing norms were challenged, new possibilities were imagined, and the foundations of our modern world were laid. As we continue to grapple with issues of equality, explore the frontiers of science and technology, question authority, and seek to balance progress with preservation of our values, we are in many ways continuing the conversations and struggles that defined this pivotal decade in American history.